Imagine waking up the day after the greatest achievement of your life, only to find out it never happened. That everything you believed in, everything you were celebrating, everything that seemed right and inevitable had crumbled in a single moment. Now imagine this didn't happen to one person. It happened to an entire country, to 200,000 people inside a stadium. And that moment was photographed, filmed, and burned into the collective memory of a nation forever. I'm talking about July 16, 1950. I'm talking about the Maracana. I'm talking about the most inexplicable, most traumatic, and most studied defeat in the history of world soccer. But what you probably don't know is that this story has layers. It has secrets. It has mistakes that were hidden for decades. And it has one player who carried the weight of an entire country on his back until the day he died. Stay until the end, because what you're about to discover today will completely change the way you see this moment. To understand the size of the tragedy, you need to understand the size of the expectation. Brazil in 1950 wasn't just a country that wanted to win a World Cup. It was a country that needed to win. That had built everything around it. That had raised with its own hands the largest stadium in the world to receive the world and show the world exactly who it was. The municipal stadium of Rio de Janeiro, which only later received the name Maracana, was rushed to completion in 1950 specifically to host the tournament. With a capacity of 200,000 people, a number that still stuns architects and engineers today, that stadium was more than concrete and steel. It was a declaration of intent. It was Brazil telling the planet, "We have arrived. We are great. We are capable. Beat us if you can." And during that tournament, it seemed like nobody could. Brazil was absolutely devastating. They crushed Mexico 4-0. Beat Yugoslavia 2-0. Didn't concede a single goal in the opening rounds. Then, already in the final stage, demolished Sweden 7-1 and Spain 6-1. 6-1. 7-1. Those were numbers that looked like they came out of a video game. The Brazilian national team of that era had Zizinho, Joey, Chico, Ademir, players who decades later were still remembered as some of the greatest to ever play the game. And they had a style of play, a cohesion, a fluidity that the world simply wasn't prepared to face. By the time the final round arrived, Brazil only needed a draw against Uruguay to be crowned champions. A draw. Just don't lose. And here begins the part that the official history took a very long time to tell completely. Because what happened in the days leading up to that match was a sequence of decisions, omissions, and arrogance that still sends chills down the spine of anyone who studies that period. Brazilian newspapers had already run headlines declaring Brazil champions before the ball was even kicked. The Brazilian Sports Confederation had already commissioned personalized gold medals engraved with the players' names. Speeches were prepared. A trophy ceremony was practically scripted. The governor of Rio de Janeiro at the time, Angelo Mendes de Moraes, walked into the locker room before the match and gave a speech that, according to the players themselves, left many of them more relieved than motivated. He said, in so many words, that the players were already champions. That all they had to do was play. That the world recognized them as the best. It was a collection of beautiful phrases that, in practice, did the exact opposite of what they were supposed to do. Uruguay arrived at that match in a completely different state of mind. They had had an inconsistent tournament, had struggled, had drawn with Spain. But they had something Brazil didn't have in that moment. The awareness that they were in enemy territory, that nobody expected anything from them, that they had absolutely nothing to lose. Coach Juan Lopez was surgical in his tactical preparation. He studied Brazil. He studied the weaknesses. And he identified something few people were saying out loud. Brazil's left flank was vulnerable. The Uruguayan right winger Alcides Ghiggia was fast, unpredictable, and was going to exploit that weakness with a coldness that bordered on supernatural. When the 200,000 people, or perhaps more, since there was never a definitive count, entered the Maracana that Sunday in July, the atmosphere was one of anticipation of a celebration already won. It wasn't the tension of a final. It was the euphoria of a coronation. People with commemorative banners. Children in costumes. The crowd was already singing as if they had already won. There was a collective sense of inevitability that today, looking back, seems almost tragic in its innocence. Soccer doesn't respect inevitability. Soccer doesn't read the newspaper. Soccer doesn't know that the speeches are already written and that the medals are already engraved. The match began and Brazil pushed forward, as expected. 2 minutes into the second half, Friaca opened the scoring. The stadium exploded. It was the moment everyone had been waiting for. It was the beginning of the confirmation of everything everyone already knew. And then, at the 21st minute of the second half, Uruguay equalized with a goal from Juan Schiaffino. The silence that fell over the Maracana in that instant was described by every witness as something supernatural. 2,000 square meters of humanity went silent simultaneously. But it was still a draw. Brazil was still champions with a draw. There were about 30 minutes left. It was possible. It was probable. It was almost certain. Then it happened. At the 34th minute of the second half, Alcides Ghiggia received the ball on the right, as he had done dozens of times throughout that World Cup. The Brazilian left back, Wold, moved toward him expecting the usual cross, the rehearsed play. But Ghiggia didn't cross. He shot toward goal. Goalkeeper Barbosa dove to the wrong side. The ball went into the corner of the net. And 200,000 people stood open-mouthed, staring at that scene as if time had stopped. Ghiggia ran to celebrate. His teammates piled on top of him. And on the other side, that ocean of humanity was in absolute shock. Over the following 30 years, Ghiggia said in interviews a phrase that became famous worldwide: "Only 3 people have ever silenced the Maracana with a single gesture: Frank Sinatra, Pope John Paul II, and me." It was a joke. It was a provocation. But it was also a perfectly accurate description of what had happened that day. Because the silence he produced wasn't the silence of a goal in any ordinary game. It was the silence of a national trauma being forged in real time. What came next is one of the darkest and most unjust stories in Brazilian soccer. Barbosa, the goalkeeper who conceded that goal, was never forgiven. Never. For the 20 years following the 1950 World Cup, he continued to play soccer, continued to be a high-level goalkeeper, continued to make extraordinary saves. But it didn't matter. Every match lost, every goal conceded was a new condemnation. The press never let anyone forget. The fans never let anyone forget. The story goes that years later, already retired, Barbosa was at a supermarket and a woman recognized him, pointed at him and said to her small child, "Look at that man. He was the one who made Brazil cry." Barbosa told that story publicly and said it was the most painful moment of his entire life. More painful than the goal itself. And there is an image, a specific photograph of that final, that encapsulates all of it in a way that is almost unbearable. It's a photo taken in the instance after Ghiggia's goal. Barbosa is on the ground, his back to the field, staring into the net. Around him, Uruguayan players embrace. And behind the net, in the background of the frame, a slice of those packed stands, 200,000 people who appear, even in the static photograph, completely paralyzed. There is no visible happiness. There is no clear reaction. It is the collective freeze of a nation at the exact moment something broke forever. This photograph is one of the most reproduced in the history of sport. And every time someone sees it for the first time, it takes a few seconds to process what they're looking at. The impact of that defeat on Brazilian soccer was enormous and lasting in ways that go far beyond results on the field. Psychologically, it created a wound that Brazil carried for 12 years, until the 1958 World Cup, when a 17-year-old Pelé and a brilliant generation finally brought home the title that had seemed stolen in 1950. But even that conquest, even the 1958 Cup, even the victories of 1962, 1970, 1994, and 2002 never completely erased what became known simply as the Maracanazo, a Spanish word the Uruguayans used to name that moment, which entered the vocabulary of world soccer as a synonym for the impossible comeback. Tactically, the defeat also generated consequences. Brazil quickly abandoned the system they had been playing, overhauled the technical staff, and began treating psychological preparation far more seriously before major tournaments. The collective arrogance of that day, the newspaper headlines, the speeches, the engraved medals, never repeated itself so explicitly again. Brazilian soccer learned, in the hardest way possible, that no game is won before it's finished. But perhaps the deepest consequence was cultural. The Maracanazo created in Brazil a culture of superstition, of bad omens, of distrust toward premature certainty that still shapes the way Brazilians root for their national team to this day. Have you ever noticed how Brazilian fans, even when the national team is dominating a match, seem incapable of fully relaxing? Always waiting for the worst to happen. That has a name. It has an address. It has a date. July 16, 1950. Third tier of the Maracana. 7 to 9th minute of the second half. And Barbosa. Barbosa died in 2000, exactly 50 years after that game. He died without ever receiving an official apology. He died without being invited to any World Cup held in Brazil. In 1994, when the national team held an open training session for the press before the United States World Cup, Barbosa showed up to watch and was barred at the entrance because a team official said his presence might bring bad luck. That man was in his late 60s, had given his entire life to Brazilian soccer, and was turned away because the superstitious feared what he represented. When he found out, Barbosa said, "In Brazil, the maximum prison sentence is 30 years. I have been serving mine for 44. That was 1994. He was still serving it. What makes this story so universally fascinating is that it's not just about soccer. It's about how communities need a scapegoat when something goes wrong. It's about how a single person can become the vessel for an entire nation's pain. It's about how the narrative we build around events often says more about us than about the events themselves. Uruguay played better that day. Brazil committed tactical errors, management errors, communication errors. But the Brazilian narrative needed a villain with a face, and it chose Barbosa. Even though he made extraordinary saves during that very game, because he did, that single goal was all that remained. It's impossible to talk about the Maracanazo without mentioning what it means to Uruguay. For that small country of just over 3 million inhabitants, that victory was the confirmation of a national identity. Uruguay had already been world champions in 1930, in the very first World Cup in history, which they also played at home. But the victory of 1950, won inside the largest stadium in the world, in front of 200,000 people, against the most heavily favored host nation soccer had ever seen, was something that transcended sport. For Uruguayans, that day became a founding myth. It became poetry. It became part of the soul of the country. Ghiggia lived to be 88 years old and until the very end of his life was treated in Uruguay like a demigod. The country's president attended his funeral. Dignitaries from across the nation came to pay their respects. For a goal in the corner of a field, in a World Cup match, 70 years prior. If this story impacted you, if you're left with that feeling of wanting to know more, of wanting to understand how soccer is so much more than a sport, that it's a mirror of who we are as people, then leave your comment down below. Tell me what you thought of this story. Tell me what city and country you're watching from right now. That detail matters to me, because this channel exists to connect people who love true stories, stories that stay with you. Leave a like if you made it this far, that helps the channel grow and reach more people who need to hear these stories. And subscribe, because every week there's a new story waiting for you, and the next ones are even more intense than this one. One more thing, I came across something really special while browsing the internet recently, a product that speaks directly to those of us who, just like me, live off nostalgia for soccer and the stories the game has produced over time. I won't spoil it, but if you're curious, check the first pinned comment below. I'm dropping the link there as a personal recommendation. Only go if you want to, I promise you'll find it interesting. And speaking of stories that stay with you, what happened in 1950 was enormous. But there is another story, from another World Cup, involving a piece of officiating so absurd, so thoroughly documented and so full of hidden details, that when I finish writing that script I'm going to need a moment just to breathe. Stay tuned. There's so much more coming.